I'll start with the how I got involved story, which leads to that part. I started as an open source user in the late 90s, I guess. I think like a lot of people did when some dude in the dorm slid me a CD and was like, hey, you should check out this Linux thing. But honestly, and I think this is still a problem so many years later, didn't really understand that it was something I could also contribute to until I actually started working for Red Hat, which was 15 years ago. And I saw this job listing one day and was like, wow, that sounds great. And it's Red Hat. I've been using that for a long time. That sounds awesome. So I then became involved in the Fedora community. And at that point in time, it really was Fedora, Red Hat Linux, and we had just acquired JBoss. That was pretty much the whole product line. So we had a couple of variations, and Carsten spoke this morning on groups that kind of were concerned with community, but not what we really call an OSPO today. That's a more modern, so to speak, idea. And so what's now Red Hat's OSPO formed about 10 years ago. It was originally called Open Source and Standards. And as evidence of the fact that OSPOs were not as common, we changed the name sort of 5 years ago, I think, when we were like, hey, we should call it what everybody else is calling it. And that's what has become Red Hat's OSPO. I left Red Hat a couple weeks ago. I have been in a new role for 26 and a half hours now, I think, 27 hours. So I'm going in a sense from one extreme of an OSPO to another. So we'll talk a little more about how OSPOs are often structured and where they sit and what they do. But Red Hat's, I've always explained, is a little different because everything Red Hat does is open source. So we had a different set of concerns, a different approach to what the OSPO was doing. My new role is at a company called SAS. If you've worked with analytics software, statistics, data sorts of things, you may be familiar, but it is a 46-year-old company that is not historically open source. So I'm going to go build that OSPO experience there and basically go from one end completely to the other. So I've, over the last number of years, talked to lots of OSPO folks in different companies and can offer a little bit of insight into how lots of other folks do it as well, but that's where I'm coming from.
Hey everyone, I'm Stephen Augustus, head of open source at Cisco. Our OSPO, I guess talking about like what OSPOs do and where we're housed, we're going to get into, again, more of the structures and why you would put them in certain places. But our OSPOs within the emerging tech and incubations group, which rolls into strategy, incubation, and application. So we sit under the EVP for applications or the chief strategy officer of Cisco. And I think that, that was a big part of me making the decision to go to Cisco in the first place. The understanding that open source software needs to be part of our strategy moving forward. So how I got started in open source, I feel like a baby in comparison to some of the illustrious careers of the people that I work with. But I started off, I want to say, I've been doing tech in general for maybe 16, 17 years, and starting in actually working on open source software in maybe 2016, 2017 at a cloud native company called CoreOS. They were then acquired by Red Hat. So I had an opportunity to go from kind of like this customer success engineer to field engineering and solutions architecture. And none of those roles actually were like, hey, go do the open source stuff. But we were in open source ecosystems. And I just found interacting with the community and building out in the open a lot more interesting than any of my actual roles. So eventually that kind of rolled into what I'm doing now. Before Cisco, I was at VMware working on doing field engineering, but then working as an open source engineer. And between that, I've picked up a few committee things like Kubernetes Steering Committee and To-Do Group, which is where I've met Stephen, but also working on the open source OpenSSF governing board. So overall, like I think pretty cool ecosystem, and understanding like the motivations about why and how to do open source, especially in industry, is going to be pretty exciting to get into. So
cool. My next question is, say that you come across someone who wants to know the benefits of OSPOs related to business values. So I know that the three of you have worked in industry for some time now. So how can that then be applied to academia?
I'm happy to take this on first and then pass it on to the others. There are tremendous benefits to having an OSPO, I believe, for a company or an industry. And it's because a lot of us are software businesses. In fact, all of us are software businesses, and all of our businesses use open source. And open source comes with some very interesting characteristics that companies are not used to managing and need to know how to manage. And an OSPO in particular helps you manage it more intentionally. And as Stephen said, more strategically, more with thought and intention, and which is very much needed. So for example, the OSPO acts as a bridge between the outside ecosystems and the inside development community inside a company. And you need that kind of a guide and navigation for the inside developers to know how to navigate with the outside world. And frankly, for the outside world to know, who do I work with inside this company on this open source project? Or if there is an issue, who do I talk to? Or for sponsorships or participation. And so you need that consistent and visible bridge and organization that can work on open source. And lots of companies see this as very strategic, very critical to their risk management, to their innovation strategy, and to their developer happiness, basically. Because developers today want to work for companies that are open source supporters, are open source good citizens, and developers don't want to work for companies that do not have any ties to open source. So with that, I'll say for universities, it's even more important because not only from the educational perspective, but also from how invention happens, how innovation happens, how you actually use OSPOs as the language, if you will, to connect with other companies and other institutions in open source to get work done. I think it's also a great way to place developers coming out of universities into very strategic open source roles inside companies. So I know my fellow panelists have a lot more to add to this, so I'll pass the baton back to Mel and to Ruth and Stephen.
Yeah, so Nithya nailed it. I have nothing else to say now. So when I think about open source and I think about the structure and the function of OSPOs, I look at it in three different lenses: the lens of the contributor, the lens of the maintainer, and the lens of the sponsor. Now, those are like, it doesn't matter if you're in industry, in academia, outside world. I think a lot of it comes down to visibility, right? Are we talking, to Nithya's point, so like the visibility of the potential contributors to open source, visibility of active maintainers and the projects that they support, the visibility of sponsorship, right? So the there's a lot of discussion around or acts of corporate altruism, right? And that's not really a thing, right? There's a business need behind it, right? The gaining visibility for your business so that we can be more successful, whether it's in hiring efforts, whether it's in selling more software, yada yada yada. In my background, having done the field engineering and the sales engineering in the past, and also going further back in the career as an IT engineer, a lot of the times I've worked in cost centers. And I think in open source, you run into this instance where you're also sort of in a cost center when every other business group is making money. So I think part of every interaction in open source is like, what's the sell, right? In each of those different lenses, the contributor, the maintainer, the sponsor, what am I selling, right? You might be selling yourself. You might be selling your company's reputation. You might be selling some sort of product. Trying to understand what you're coming to the table with or where you're coming to the table for is really important. And I think even coming into roles, getting started in an OSPO, like becoming a new OSPO member, like this is my first OSPO. This is my first, like, one, being in an OSPO, two, running an OSPO, and coming to the table and having that new lens of like sponsor added to it, right? That's an entirely new lens. Trying to understand how to manage those relationships. Really, it comes down to being that that bridge, that conduit, as Nithya was mentioning, understanding how to connect all of these disparate groups. And I think that concern is separate from the industry or academia. It's important for all of us.
So the only thing I'd add to all that, if you need to justify starting an OSPO and write down the why and give somebody a lengthy paper on why you should do this, there are 1,000 blog posts, articles, white papers already, and you can go read those. But I would simplify it as, if you care about something, if you believe it is important to your business or your university or whatever, you hire someone to think about it all day, whatever the role is. You can think of an assortment of departments. Maybe it's even, the university cares about environment, so we created a whole environmental department, right? If you care about something, if it's important, you make sure that someone or a team of someone's is doing nothing but thinking about that all day. And that's what an OSPO is thinking about how open source affects your business or your university. And that is their entire job.
Very cool. Next question. What do you suppose is the most difficult challenge you're facing, as well as what is the most exciting thing about an OSPO?
I'll continue the pattern of starting the answers, being virtual and all. And thank you, Stephen. Thank you to OpenRIT for giving me a chance to participate remotely. I would say there are two really hard things. One is compliance is hard because compliance tooling, compliance processes are still evolving, even though, we've been doing this for 20, 25 years. And especially when you're doing it at scale, like we do at Amazon, it becomes very hard to build the right tooling, the right processes, such that we are not too heavyweight and come in the way of engineers doing their job, but we do the right level of due diligence on compliance matters, whether it's contributing or distributing software or using a new open source license. So it's really one of the big areas that our OSPO focuses on, is how do we do compliance correctly, and how do we make it easy for our engineers to remember the legal aspects of open source. The second one I would say that's hard is hiring good people into an OSPO. And I think Stephen and Ruth are unique people. Some of the OSPO folks come with some really broad and intersectional set of skills. They are at one time be able to work in marketing and community and communications, and another time work in licensing and understand and have a good conversation with the IP and legal teams. And then they have to also be able to pivot and understand developers and interact with developers, and then with community outside the company, such as foundations and other institutions. So it's a difficult skill to find, and there are very few really wonderful and skilled OSPO folks around the world. And growing that competence is extremely important and hard to do. So that, I would say, those are the two hard things, Mel. The easy and the exciting thing, I would say, is how OSPOs are getting recognized as very strategic to innovation.
So as for
inside
me,
companies,
sorry.
everyone, yeah, and in the ecosystems. Sorry about that. Take it.
Yeah, sorry, you froze and I thought you were done talking. but we promise not to take any screenshots of the frozen faces because I know you never freeze on the good. Nobody ever freezes on the good face. I had somebody do that in a meeting a couple weeks ago, like froze on a good face. I was like, you got to see this happen. But so I was going to say, as for me, literally everything about starting an open source program in a proprietary software company is exciting and challenging. So all of it, but more broadly, I would say one of the biggest challenges is finding everyone in your organization who is doing something with open source when you need to know about it. So, it turns out Jeff down the street has a GitHub repo that we really should have known about like 6 months ago. Or, so-and-so over there has joined another foundation for $250,000, didn't tell anybody. So finding all those folks and coordinating those efforts. I think one of the most useful things that we did in Red Hat's OSPO about 5+ years ago, it's grown, it's changed over time, but was to consolidate joining those things. So I think Red Hat's up to about 70 memberships in assorted foundations and standards bodies and whatnot. And it used to be just that someone would say we should join a thing, and they would join a thing, and then we would just keep paying the thing forever, and nobody was paying any attention to it. But developing a process and a policy and a mission around why you join things. So I tend to think there are two basic approaches to joining foundations and other organizations. And one is drop some money to slap your logo on it. And the other is to actually participate. And one of these is the right way to do it. And the other is not. So having a structure where you can actually drive participation and being a part of something rather than just getting the benefit of your logo on it, but also convincing the rest of the organization that that is the right way and that they shouldn't just go drop 50K because they had it in their budget at the end of the year. And I had one other thought that will come back to me while Stephen talks.
So easy and hard. I think a lot of that resonated with me just now. Logo slapping and 250K and et cetera, et cetera. But I think the easy part for me in joining Cisco, at least on the personal level, was that I wasn't planning on joining unless I knew that open source was going to be supported. And I was essentially told, like, you were the tip of the spear. And this is blessed from executive leadership. Go forth, and anything open source, like, that's you now. The hard part of that is the getting other people to understand that that's the message, and corralling all of those conversations, whether it's around foundations and the archaeology that you have to do to understand who paid for what at what time, are they even still at the company, who's managing the CLAs for the various Linux Foundation things that we're signed up for, who's talking about open source. Someone just published a blog and it's about, like, how Cisco contributes to open source. And you're like, wait a second, maybe I should have had some review of that perhaps. And they're like, oh, we didn't even know the OSPO existed. And we're like, yeah, well, we were one person and now we're 3 people for a company of 80,000 people or so. I think one of the really hard things on a personal level, and I think on a team level, is understanding how to scale yourself, understanding how to step outside of the tasks that you were used to doing. I spent a lot of time on the terminal. I can't really do that anymore. I spend more time on Zoom or WebEx or insert video conference platform here. So establishing a web of trust, so to speak, across the company. I hired people who I think are some of the best open source talent I've seen on the planet. So I can, if I hand them something, I know it's going to get done, and I know it's going to get high. It's going to be high quality. There's no conversation about, like, do you have the autonomy to do this? Like, you do. Go do the thing, make the connection, have the meeting, sign the paperwork, and, like, let's move the ball forward. And then that frees me up to have these more strategic conversations across business groups with other directors and VPs, to help them understand that, like, we're here to help. We're a center of excellence for you. We're not open source for this entire company. It's impossible for us to be that. We are, again, that conduit, that conduit to help you be successful. So that is that. A lot of the hard things, they're all hard honestly. But yeah, I think maybe the hardest one is figuring out what to do with your day, and not trying to do it all, because open source is fast and expansive, and you can't get it all done, regardless of the size of the team that you have. So.
I think I just wanted to add one more thing to what Stephen said. Scaling is hard. And the only way OSPOs can scale is if you enable developers to do more and more on their own and do self-service, right? And educate them on the issues that matter from an open source perspective, and that there's an OSPO that they should engage when they need to. Because you can be everywhere. And as Stephen pointed out, when you have thousands and thousands of people in the company, OSPOs typically tend to be very small. They tend to be anywhere between, one person who's running this for the entire company to maybe a couple of dozen people, 24, 30 people in very, very large companies. And so enabling the teams to putting, automation, putting self-service in place, putting education in place is the only way to, continue to scale the expertise of the OSPO.
And I would just add to that. So your OSPO may be small, but that doesn't mean that there aren't resources everywhere, where if you can have 2 hours a week of that person's time and an hour a month from that person, eventually that adds up to a whole lot. That's how this whole community thing works. That's the foundation of open source, right? So just because your OSPO is small doesn't mean that it has small ability.
And yeah, and I think that, maybe that's part of the reason that we have this idea of like, not open source offices per se, but open source program offices, to kind of hint at the fact that we are helping build programs for the entire company, or for local groups to do that thing, not necessarily that we're going to do all of it ourselves, because again, not possible. Scaling is hard.
Oh, I believe we have a question.
Let's get it.
When you look at corporate OSPOs, there are corporate OSPOs that exist to sort of achieve different directives. There are companies who are more focused on controlling their open source software, and companies more focused on generating community. And I'm wondering if so I'm just wondering if you can comment about how OSPOs might be shaped differently corporately in those different sort of motivational contexts.
I actually have, wait, I have notes. I swear he didn't like plant this question. I just happen to have notes relevant to it. So I've known you for 14 years. Okay. So I was looking at the Linux Foundation has an organization called the To-Do Group that I think Stephen mentioned early on, which is a group of people in OSPOs who come together to talk about OSPO-y things. And for 4 years, they've done this survey where they look at the growth of OSPOs, what they're doing, where they are, that sort of thing. And I was looking at this year's report that came out in February, and it lists a series of steps as a maturity model, which I think is basically what you're asking. But I'm not sure I agree with that outline, because I think that you could come in a lot of places on what they describe as a series of steps. So the way they list it is step 0 is adoption of open source, which that seems fair. People are using open source around the organization. Then compliance, legal questions, developer education, that sort of thing. Then community education and participation in the ecosystem. I'm not sure that necessarily is a process. Then engagement, hosting projects, growing communities, and finally leadership and becoming a strategic decision maker in the organization. So I think those are more like a list of likely functions of an OSPO rather than actually a sequential series of steps you go through. That may be someone's path, but I don't think that's necessarily always the path.
I would say some companies do follow that path. In some of the more traditional enterprise companies, as opposed to tech companies that I've been in, I've found that consumption is easy. Everybody starts consuming open source software, and then the lawyers get word of it and they say, oh my goodness, we need to now get control or start making sure that we have compliance in place. And then there's a random developer who wants to, contribute back. And some companies don't allow contributions, perhaps, but he or she wants to contribute back. And then you start realizing that you need to have community engagement, plans in place. And then really the ultimate is when you are releasing software, when you are creating communities, when you are engaged in lots of different companies. For our company, it was all of the above, and actually, different parts of the company engaged differently. So it's uneven, if you will, across the company. There was no corporate edict which said, this is the reason why or how we want to engage with open source, but it was based on the needs of different businesses. So I have some businesses in the company that are highly community engaged because that's needed for their business. And then there are some teams in the company who frankly just stop at compliance and don't want to go beyond compliance because the nature of the business is that they do not contribute back or they do not engage. So our job as an OSPO sometimes is to create more evenness of competency across the company, but also be cognizant of the unique and individual business needs across the company. Back to you.
I would also argue that step 0 is not using open source, but being aware that you're using open source, because I'm pretty sure it's literally impossible in 2022 to actually not use open source in any fashion whatsoever. You just might not understand.
Yeah, so I think, again, going back to these like cost centers, there's a problem that you have when you start an open source program office is that you're on the back foot. Like that there's usually there's a business already built. And open source is kind of like this, in a lot of places, it's been this afterthought, right? So, depending on where the OSPO ends up, and they've ended up in marketing and engineering and legal and compliance, and like that gives a bit of color around what the goals were, or like which people were thinking about it at what time. I really like the fact that our OSPO is housed in strategy. It signals that we think this is core to the business, right? And were I not at Cisco, I would be at Red Hat actually in their OSPO. And I think that is one of the great models for OSPOs in general, right? And not just the OSPO, but Octo overall, right? So having research and emerging tech and incubation and the OSPO function kind of sitting close by, right? These are a lot of these trend spotting groups, right? That kind of and that helps you structuring things like near strategy, near emerging innovations, or whatever you want to call them for your business. It kind of signals that like we're trying to get ahead of these needs as opposed to work them into existing structures, because they don't really fit well into existing structures.
Could you please discuss or, define compliance?
Okay, I'll take a stab at this, and please feel free to add to it. There are two unique aspects about open source that I always talk about. One is that it comes with a license that's unique to open source, frankly. It's not a commercial license. It is a license that's created by the maintainer to propagate the software. The second aspect of open source is community, how it's developed, right? It's collaboratively developed globally by a group of people who are interested in solving that particular problem. So the license aspect of open source is what compliance cares about. So compliance to me is, first of all, respecting the license. What the developer of that software is telling us is, hey, you can have this, but I would like you to respect this license. And when you distribute it or when you share it with others, please respect some of the obligations attached to this license. For example, you have to publish the copyright, or you have to mention, the license name, and also ensure that the license is carried forward in derivative works. So understanding and respecting the license is one aspect of compliance. A second is there are constantly new licenses coming about. In fact, OSI has a certain number of approved licenses, but in open source in general, there are thousands of licenses. So helping a developer unpack what the license is and whether it's okay to use or not okay to use as a company, as it pertains to the company's IP rights and other software that they write, is an important part of compliance. So education around compliance. And the third is really helping our developers release their software with the proper license and proper attributions. And then lastly, distributing the software with the right obligations, if you will, that the software license includes. For example, when you distribute GPL, you need to make the source code available. You also need to post an attribution notice, which includes the license, copyrights, etc. So it's really enabling our developers on all aspects of the licensing and legal aspects of open source. One last area, two other areas I'll talk about is one is also protecting the company's IP. There are certain licenses, when you use them incorrectly, it could compromise the company's IP. So really protecting company IP by using open source correctly. The last one is often companies, acquire companies. So in mergers and acquisitions, making sure that the company you're acquiring is not bringing any new license risk or compliance risk to the company, and that you understand the licenses they're using and how they're using and their knowledge level on compliance. So making sure that you're protecting the company's rights, but also respecting the license is to me compliance.
Again, in one of my past lives, I was in production engineer or site reliability engineer. And one of the things that these roles often have to consider is like what happens when something goes wrong. I think there was a very positive light from Nithya around the compliance subject, but I think about fear and risk. What is the cost of doing business if we do this incorrectly? Talking to some lawyer friends in the past, one of the things that they've said was, we exist entirely to make sure this lawsuit doesn't happen again, right? And that is that, really that is we're not doing it for fun. Like there's a cost of doing business, and again, managing open source software, managing groups that might use open source software, even if they're not realizing that they're using it, there's a huge amount of risk associated with it. A developer, just the fact that you can go out and get it on the internet for free makes it that more likely that it's going to be used, right? And if we don't manage the way that we report the way we're using software, really developer education, right? Not just developer education, but their management and their management's management, and again, having a tight relationship with legal, because like there's a huge risk component to it.
Well, you guys took good cop, bad cop, so I'm good. I mean, yeah, it's the two sides of the coin. The importance of the risk management, but also the importance to the community. So yeah, we could give a whole day's workshop on licenses and compliance and all, but that was a solid summary.
Open source is never, it doesn't get boring. It's always changing. It's flexible. So I'd like you to talk about a time when you had a plan, you thought you knew what you were doing to achieve something, and then something arose that led you to pivot.
Go for it, Stephen. I'm still thinking about a pivot story.
I I don't think there's a time that I've had a plan that's gone exactly as planned. So I think, you know, especially now with foundations like OpenSSF, right, and the conversations that we've been having with the White House around how governments handle open source software, or like, develop policy around it. It's flipping a lot of the you know, the notional constructs of certain pieces of software or certain communities on its head, trying to understand how to handle again, going back to this risk component, trying to understand how to handle vulnerability management in communities where if you've seen the XKCD little, like, the dependency Legos, where there's a little Jenga block in the entire structure, and it's like this one open source maintainer in Nebraska or something, right? And it's the you know, the component that's holding up the entire tree. If I think about Kubernetes, for example, right, the brains of Kubernetes is etcd, and right now there is a maintainer problem around etcd, right, and it's causing reliability problems within these large scale clusters. This is not just cluster level. This is obviously business level, right? So if you look at managed services across the AWSs and the Microsofts and you know, and the Googles, this has real business impact of doing it wrong. So you have to ask the question, like, do we fund, you know, do we help fund etcd, right? I think about it as, like, you know, CoreOS, a place that's where etcd came out of, right? So there's a personal want to do it, and there's a business need to be supporting these things. So, like, having those conversations of, like, you know, just realizing, hey, I'm not as read up on vulnerability management as I need to be, or community management, or understanding where certain patterns may exist, why people are leaving these communities. You know, if I, not necessarily leaving communities, but if it's a small community to start with, and it is the etcd, for example, is a distributed systems database, right, and it requires there's a huge ramp up period, and part of the reason I was speaking about these three different lenses, contributors, maintainers, and sponsors, is because, like, the maintainers are really a subset of that contributors portion, but to get from contributor to maintainer is not a small feat. It takes sustained contribution to a project. So realizing that you may not have that skill set within your company, within your community, understanding how to, what that becomes is there's this entire role of community education. There's this entire role of, like, how do I build a community? Like, we're missing the skill set, or people are leaving. Like, we have to make it easier for people to understand this technology so that they can help support it. So no one day is the same. No, I don't think any plan survives first impact with, you know, day to day. And I think you know, everything, you know, one of the things that I tell one of my teams in Kubernetes is that anything that you think is anything that's written down, like, feel free to throw it out. It was maybe correct at the time that we wrote it, but it's a living document. You should come here. The reason you were hired or enlisted for this team is that you're supposed to question these processes. You're supposed to help improve these processes. So if you're not doing that, you have to be flexible. You have to challenge what's written and improve it over time. So don't make plans that are too rigid, I guess.
Yeah, I think you covered a lot of aspects of the pivot that one needs to go through as an OSPO person. I would say agility, as Stephen, I think, was alluding to, is such an important aspect of being an OSPO person, is because things constantly change, Mel, as you indicated. Licenses change constantly. And so if you had consumed something under the assumption that this was a particular license and then suddenly it changes, then you need to react to it and you need to advise your developers on how to react to it. As security is something that's front and center now. And so as an OSPO, you've got to broaden your horizons to how do I partner with my security teams in the company? What value do I bring to the open source security discussion? How do I get ahead of open source security issues and challenges through my knowledge of the ecosystems and my knowledge of how open source works? And then what functions in the company do I need to work with? Clearly legal, marketing, and certainly public relations, and other aspects of the company, and developing really good relationships with leadership inside the company, and not assuming that everyone knows open source as well as you do. So making sure to continue to share the nuances of open source and acting as an advocate for the company outside, but as an educator and a culture guide, if you will, inside. And all of this requires you to constantly be agile and change with the needs of the business and the changes in the community and changes in your role and scope of the role. Back to you guys.
So here's another way of defining an OSPO and what it does. Particularly if you reach that point of participating in projects, especially hosting them, leading them, you are, as the OSPO, responsible for working with thousands and thousands of people making decisions that are critical to your business who do not work for you or your organization. That's what your OSPO does. If pivoting is not for you, then the OSPO life may also not be for you.
I'm wondering about common misconceptions that might be in place about your role within an OSPO. And what misconceptions have you seen and how do you attempt to address those and help people understand and resolve that confusion?
Mel, one of the things that coming into an OSPO one may think is that you need to know all of the different technology areas that open source is in. Forget that misconception right from the start, because you cannot be a technical expert in everything. What you are is an expert in navigating open source and the culture of open source. And you need to pair up and partner with a technologist in the company who understands that particular technology. And together you can, participate and work through all of that. The second misconception I would say, which we've talked about or alluded to, is that an OSPO needs to do everything open source for the entire company. Not at all. If you can partner with groups inside the company and help them do their open source more effectively, or people who spend a little bit of time helping the OSPO scale, or through automation and tooling, then you can do the job. But if you buy into the myth that you need to be everywhere, know everything, and have to do all things open source for the company, then you'll fail miserably.
I think maybe more than having a misconception about what you do, the problem is often having people even be aware that the OSPO exists. Well, do you find that in Cisco? Like, if there are only like 3 of you and how many people, how many employees do you have? Like a jillion, roughly?
Yeah, no, I mean, that nails it. So I started off the first year and change of my tenure. I was one person. I was a one-person OSPO. So of course things fall through the cracks. You don't understand where to go for support for certain things. I've heard from people externally. Oh, I didn't even know Cisco did open source until you joined, and like that's a problem for me, right? That's the misconception that I have to fix, or I have to help fix. Again, we don't do it all. there's a concept of ownership, whether it's a personal team ownership, external territorialism. I spend a lot of my day like, hey, that's my thing. And you're like, I don't want to own your thing. I don't think you understand how this model works. Like, I'm trying to teach you how to share your thing. And, so like having conversations where people may feel that, open source program officers are maybe like, you know, jumping into their territory and kind of helping them understand, like, whether it's through building, one of the things that we're trying to do right now is kind of build out our inner source program, which is like, it's like, what if you took open source principles and you did that for the stuff that you're working on internally? And that's a wild oversimplification. But even having those conversations of like, why should my business group even share this code? It's interesting to me, because like the reason I went for open source is because like I thought there's such power and magic in the idea that you can share that code, right? And if you look at it from a business perspective, without being the weird, like, the corporate without doing like weird corporate speak and saying like, with OSPOs, I mean, if we're participating in open source communities, we can monetize people who don't even work for us. Like, wow, isn't that great? Like, no, that's terrible. Don't say that. Don't. But there is, but if you think about, working on inner source, for example, you get to, there's a force multiplier of being able to contribute back to code that you're working on internally, or other business groups are working on internally. And like, that's such a powerful concept that I kind of like hesitate to understand why it needs justification. So I think I spend most of my day wondering why, and for a lot of open source people, like, justifying our existence, like why did I have to explain that this is easy? This should be easy, right?
Yeah, so I'm going to rewind 4 questions ago because of something you said, but on challenges, it's simply teaching adults that sharing is okay and that collaboration is what we do, and it's on purpose. Because since you were in kindergarten, you were taught to keep your eyes on your own paper and you're judged on your own work. And then you grow up and you graduate and you get a job in some awful work culture where if you get a promotion, the person next to you doesn't. And it's all about you and what you've done today. And that makes people inclined not to share, not to work with other people. And so breaking down that mindset and encouraging them that sharing is in fact what we do on purpose, and collaborating actually makes everything better, is one of the biggest challenges for open source in general and OSPOs.
I know that the panel started a little late as scheduled, so let's make this the last question before lunch. What questions do the panelists wish I had asked? And then answer it.
Mel, I think you asked all the right questions about OSPOs. I think it's worth iterating. I'll just use this time to say that I'm super, super excited that universities like RIT and the University of California in Santa Cruz and Johns Hopkins, et cetera, are also starting OSPOs. OSPOs are not limited to businesses. OSPOs belong in all institutions. In fact, the World Health Organization started an OSPO, and it is just a great way to have someone focus on open source. As Ruth said, if you believe that this is important, and open source, in fact, is the world's most effective way to innovate today. And you do need to have an organization that's focused on open source in whatever industry, whatever organization you're in. So congratulations to the RIT OSPO as well for taking this on. And frankly, Stephen and RIT has been leaders in this, advancing that knowledge.
One thing we talked about when we had chatted before coming today was about who is in your OSPO and where it sits. So I think that the answer for that, if you're starting from scratch, depends on what problems you're trying to address initially. So OSPO, like we're talking about OSPO like it's a singular thing, like you're going to set up an accounting department and hire some accountants, except that's not how it works at all. They all look wildly different. So there are OSPOs that are heavily focused on the compliance issues we talked about and mostly made up of people who think about legal things all day. There are OSPOs that are largely people working directly in communities and doing community leadership sorts of things. I talked to someone recently whose OSPO is entirely engineers, and it was sort of an interesting approach in that the company, it's a software company, they have lots of engineers, but the ones who sit in the OSPO only work on open source as an insurance policy. So if someone ever says, you don't get to spend time on open source anymore, there are people who only do that, which I thought was an interesting approach. So I think as for where they sit in companies, it's generally either in an engineering R&D place or under the CTO, but there are a handful that are in the legal department. Like where it sits really depends, I think, on what they're going to be doing and what you hope they'll be doing eventually.
Yeah. Wow, that was cool. I don't have a question for myself that I want to then answer, but I have a question for y'all, and it's what are you going to take away from this, right? Because I think we have this like huge opportunity to collaborate and contribute this week, and already like seeing the sitting for the previous panel, I'm like, I want to meet all of those people and see how Cisco can help them and how we can help each other, and hook them up with our research department, and or maybe they're already connected. But like I would encourage all of you to have like let your walls down, have conversations, like have really deep conversations and talk about your fears and aspirations and all of that good stuff. So yeah, no questions, but like rock on.
Well, I want to thank the panel and thank the audience as well. And I'm going to do a little self-promotion now. I am looking for work beginning in 2023. So if you'd like to talk about opportunities, please find me. And I believe now it's time for lunch.
Thank you.
Have lunch.